All right, Colin, welcome to the podcast. It's amazing to have you here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. And so it feels right to start it out with a little bit of an introduction. I found your work through you've been traveling quite a bit throughout your life and been very active online. And so I would love to hear about kind of your journey around traveling and some of the how you began doing the work you've been doing online, being an author, a journalist, all this stuff. It's a huge question. I usually ask these massive questions, but whatever feels right whatever direction you'd love to take that in, I'd love to hear.
For sure. So when I was in school, when I was at university, I started up my first couple of businesses and did a whole lot of failing and got that valuable education in place to kind of see what I wanted to do with my life. And at that point, it was to be a successful entrepreneur, according to a collection of different metrics that I'd been handed, that I'd inherited from society and mentors and such over the course of my life. So when I graduated, I went out to LA and started up a branding studio, and that did pretty well, actually, all things considered. And so for the first time in my life, I had some money and I had some prestige and I had everything going for me according to those metrics. But then I also, very fortunately, shortly after my 24th birthday, I believe, had the opportunity to take a look at my life and what I was building and where I was going at the macro scale, and to see it at arm's length and take that great big view and realize that that was not the race I wanted to be running. And I was exhausting myself running it, but I actually had some other goals that I told myself were ultimately where I would end up. But I finally acknowledged to myself that I probably didn't have to finish that race before I started to pursue those other goals. And those other goals were basically all oriented around broadening my horizons, because I had grown up in the Midwest and I had never left the country at that point, still moving into my mid-20s. And that was something that I desperately wanted to do. I was just so utterly fascinated by it, fascinated by other people, history and cultures and backgrounds and different ways of looking at the world. And I told myself that's why I was pursuing this super business focused path, because then I would get rich and I'd be able to retire young, and then I'd go travel, and then I'd go live. Finally, whenever that happened, then I would live. And until that point, I didn't have to worry about the living thing, because it was all preparatory. It was all runway. And acknowledging to myself that I could probably do away with the runway and just start doing that stuff now if I changed some of my metrics and what I was measuring, and some of my ideas about what I had to spend, for instance, to live, and what my priorities actually were. If I did that, I could probably more or less start traveling tomorrow. And so I did, not tomorrow, but I gave myself 4 months. And during that 4-month period, I essentially took my entire life apart and got rid of everything I owned that wouldn't fit into a carry-on bag, and figured out what I was going to do with myself. And part of that was starting a blog, which is what young men in the United States do when they are trying to discover themselves, I believe. At least it was back in 2009. And I think now it's podcasting that people do that with. But at the time it was blogging. So I started a blog, and I started to write about these things I was thinking about and the things that I was doing, and trying to make connections with people in other countries too, because again, I hadn't left the country, and I wanted to visit these places and meet people who were not being paid to sit and have a conversation with me, basically. So outside of the tourism industry. And I started to make those connections, and then I hit the road, and I had my readers vote on where I would go, because I honestly had no idea. And they chose well, and I lived in Argentina for 4 months, and then I decided that that was a good amount of time. It was enough to put down some roots and meet some people and see some things, but not so much that I wouldn't be able to visit other places as well and see more things and round out my very two-dimensional view at that point of the world. So that kind of built the foundation of the next, 7 or 8 years. And then at that point, I had done that enough that it wasn't that it wasn't valuable or surprising or interesting anymore. It's just that it was familiar. It became a familiar set of challenges and fears. And the thing that became really scary to me was actually like having to buy furniture and getting mail on a regular basis, like these super normal things from before. I had changed so much in the interim that I didn't have any sense of who I was in the context of holding still. And I worried that I would become the kind of person who couldn't be happy if I wasn't just moving constantly and wasn't perpetually seeking out the most extreme novelty I could find. I didn't want to be that guy who had to get like a shark. I didn't want to die if I stopped moving.
Mm.
So I decided to experiment with that. And so I settled down in the US in 2016 in Wichita, Kansas, the most exotic place I could think to go in the United States. And I lived there for about a year. And I actually enjoyed it enough that then I lived in another place. I had my readers vote on what state, and they chose Tennessee. So I moved to Memphis for about a year as well. And during that period, I was able to explore just so many different things that weren't, they were technically possible when I was on the road, but they would have been very difficult for me to explore the way that I wanted to explore them. Things like working in audio and video, things like cooking. These are the types of long duration processes that the way that I prefer to learn, I wanted a consistent set of infrastructure and tools to work with. And you can carry a lot of stuff in your carry-on bag, but you do not want to haul around cast iron pots and pans. And it's very difficult to bring your guitar or the other things that you might need to do these things at a level that allows you to actually learn and grow. And so during that period, I did all of these things, and it was phenomenal and growth inducing of in a different way than travel is, but it felt like it was stimulating the same part of my brain. And so learning from that, I then started to remix the model more, and I decided to go on a speaking tour. Speaking is something that I do quite a bit, usually on tour with other people or at conferences, and I'd never put on my own tour, so I thought that would be fun. And so I also realized when I was getting my radio operator's license, which was just a random tangent I went down at one point, that I had never set foot in an RV. And so I decided to buy an old one of those and fix it up and full time in that while I was on tour around North America. And so I did that for the better part of a year. And then pardon me, and then I went to live in London for a bit. And then I came back to the United States to visit my parents in Missouri, and a global pandemic happened. So I was very fortunate in a way that I got back to the States when I did, because we were discussing a bit before we started recording that it's a little bit tumultuous during a global pandemic to try to cross national borders at times.
Right.
But it was also fortunate because I got to spend that time with my family, which is something I've always tried to make time for, but I got to spend an extended duration with my family.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fortunate to have had the time to hold still a bit before that period too, back in Wichita and Memphis, because that gave me the framework to use so that I could make the best use of my time while I was waiting for the pandemic to end, I guess, sitting in my little sister's old bedroom in central Missouri, and twiddling my thumbs and not being able to travel, but still being able to grow, fortunately. And that's kind of where I find myself now. I'm in Milwaukee now, so I've got a place that I'm renting here for a year to see if I want to invest in a more permanent home base from which to travel in the area. I love the Great Lakes region, and Milwaukee is a really lovely city with a lot of just absolutely stunning attributes. But I'm checking it out, and I'm doing that internal travel right now, I guess is what I could best describe it as, and focusing on that, and then waiting to see what happens with the global travel situation. Hopefully something changes substantially in the near future.
Yeah, so fascinating, so fascinating. I remember reading something about, because in the whole minimalism movement, there's this kind of everyone would like point to you of like, this guy has like 50 items in his carry-on and he's traveling, like this is the minimalist, you know. But I remember reading a lot of your newsletters like a while back, and I really loved the way you kind of position minimalism, which is like just super intentional living, right? And it's just like, what type of lifestyle do you want to live? It kind of goes on like kind of the art that you just presented of, all right, I realized this lifestyle wasn't fitting my dreams, and so I shifted it. And that actually meant having only 50 items. But for someone else, it could mean settling down in Milwaukee and learning guitar or something, you know, like it's just whatever phase of life that you find yourself in. What is the most intentional way to live that?
And I have way more than 50 things now. I probably have 50 things, well, more than 50 things maybe in my kitchen alone. But I
Right.
mean, that fits where I'm at right now because I cook essentially every meal I eat. And I have a very humble production studio set up in the second bedroom. Like I've got stuff now, but I could point at literally anything in my home and tell you exactly why I have it and exactly why that version of that thing. So it translates and it scales. And I think you still want to be careful, but minimalism, the gateway concept to minimalism, I think very often is decluttering or owning a finite number of things. That's not the point. Like the point is so that you have the time, energy, and resources to spend on the important things. And that might mean travel. That might mean spending more time with loved ones. It might mean having the opportunity to settle down in Milwaukee for a spell and, just cook a whole lot of curry and record some podcasts about whatever and learn some Mandarin. Like there's different phases and different priorities. We're all different. There's no wrong thing to want, but there's just an infinite number of different ways that we can optimize for those things.
Absolutely. Um, I'm super curious to double click on the whole what you brought up around going from Argentina, every country for like 4 months at a time, 6 months at a time, and then almost feeling that having a place and getting mail and buying furniture was almost more scary. And I'm super curious in part because like I did a little 5 month trip where I was kind of in a place. I tried to stay at least 1 month in every place because like I found it was almost there was no point in my eyes to like going 3 days in every single place. It just felt like not feasible. But I noticed as I would travel like a month in each place throughout Mexico, Guatemala, all these places, the people that I would meet would be like, all right, we get to know each other for a week and then we'd move on. And then we get to know each other for a week and then we move on, or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but it was never like very long. And then after a while, I feel like I almost started to get a similar feeling of like, I'm just like the person that like constantly moves on and never gets to know anyone more than 2 weeks. And it's like I'm constantly just changing. And there's nothing that's ever actually stable. And it almost felt like the scariest thing was to go back to the US for 3 months or something and to actually like build some sort of relationships for 3 months at a time at least. So I'm super curious to hear to just double click on that and to dive more into more the relationships and like the temporariness of travel and kind of how you balance the fact of moving locations constantly, but also maintaining some sort of stability in your relationships and your projects and kind of how you balance those.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of different types of relationships, and it's possible to plant the seed for longer term friendships or other sorts of relationships when you're traveling. It takes a lot of effort though, and some people are just not going to be interested, and it makes sense why they wouldn't be, because for a lot of people, the best friendships are the ones where you get to see that person in person on a regular basis, maybe every day, maybe once or twice a week. But when you're not available for board game night for years at a time, potentially, it puts kind of a cap on what the friendship can be or what type of friendship it can be. And I have people that I've been meeting up with in various countries around the world a decade after I met them when I first started traveling. There's actually people here in Milwaukee that I knew in my LA days, and we reconnected immediately. I didn't even realize they were here, which tells you the type of friendship it was, where we'd touch base like every few years, maybe. But it was still something that's maintainable because it takes the nature of the relationship and the needs of and contexts of the people into account. So there's no correct way to do relationships and no incorrect way to do them, as long as everybody involved is getting what they need out of the situation. That said, it can be kind of a lonely thing when you're just hustling and going from place to place to place. And there's benefits in a way to getting good, to becoming more skilled at making connections with people of any shape or size and valuing them for what they are, rather than needing all of them to be best friends or lifelong relationships. And to me, that's something that I feel like has exercised my muscle to just appreciate people, even if I'll never see them again, or even if I don't know them, to not need them to be close kin or people who are best friends for me to care about them, because I know I've gotten to know on a deeper level somebody for a couple of weeks, And that is a very long time for a stranger, essentially, and somebody who then becomes a stranger again, if that makes sense. So I think that's an okay thing to do, and it's an okay type of relationship or skill base to cultivate. But it is a different thing to go deep rather than broad with knowledge or with exploration, to stay in one place and learn one city like the back of your hand and just learn it over the course of 10 years. That's a very different type of exploration than it is traveling to 10 different places for 1 year at a time, or 100 different places over just a month or so at a time. So I think it's good to have both, and I think it's good to be able to do both. And that for me was why I wanted to rebalance my approach, because I felt like I was becoming a little imbalanced toward the first type of just hopping around and going broad. And I felt at that point I had enough breadth. I had seen enough of the roundness of different cultures and people and backgrounds to have a sense of what differences there might be. And at that point, I decided it might be more interesting and more difficult and just challenging for my preferences at that time too, to force myself to kind of hold still and be happy with whatever that gave me. And I anticipated the worst, to be perfectly frank. I thought, let's go to Wichita, Kansas, and God knows what's going to happen, but you can suffer through anything for a year. It was actually wonderful. There's so many elements of not bopping about the world at a regular clip that are just lovely. There's a consistency. You get better sleep. I knew this from my entrepreneur days, but I will tell myself, I will swear on a stack of secular Bibles that I can operate on 5 hours of sleep. No, not to the level that I can operate on 8 hours of sleep. And that's something that you don't really realize until you have the same bed consistently for months at a time, and you can like fully relax and settle down and not be completely alert for whatever weirdness is going to disturb you in your new unfamiliar environment. So there's all kinds of things that you don't appreciate. And it's only by facing those differing variables that you even stand a chance of recognizing this. So yeah, I mean, for me at that point, the scary thing had become holding still. And now, fortunately, I think I've got a slightly better balance, so I can look at both and say these are valid options. But it takes some time, and it does take doing things that seem incongruous at times with who you perceive yourself to be in order to reestablish that balance, because you can very easily start to perceive yourself or have other people perceive you as travel guy. And then you're like, oh my God, who am I when I'm not traveling? Who is travel guy when he's not traveling? He's just guy. Oh God, no, who am I now? and I think it's important to make sure that you can be somebody that you're proud of, and that you can put clear, that you can communicate things and also learn things from the world, no matter what your circumstances happen to be, even if it takes a little bit of work to get there sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I get this sense listening to you that there's almost this sensing into what feels right at the moment, like before I went on my trip, I was like, I had this strong desire to just open up the possibilities of cultures and people, and so then I traveled to some countries, met so many people, and then after a while that kind of fettered out, and I had this feeling of, all right, now it feels like the natural like play of life is going towards the more community based one location, and it almost feels like I'm sure that's going to eventually lead to wanting to go and open up the possibilities again and see new countries and cultures. And it almost feels like what I'm sensing is like there's no one right answer. It sounds like it's just like what feels right to you given the certain context of your life and environments and relationships at this moment.
And it's just, yeah, it's paying attention to that and allowing yourself to acknowledge it, because that can be painful, because it can seem discordant with who you perceive yourself to be. It can seem weird. You might worry even that people in your life will be like, wait, travel guy is going to do what? Wait, minimalist guy is going to own more than 50 things in his kitchen. And that can be weird. But I think it's important to be malleable and to be flexible,
Mm.
both in terms of, because we don't really know what's going to happen. So it's good to have that skill in your back pocket, but also for yourself, because that's what allows you to grow. I mean, that's shedding your skin. That is evolving into a different version of yourself. And it's not something, just because you try things doesn't mean that it defines you. And just because you try things doesn't mean that's forever. And I think being able to keep your finger on that pulse and be aware of it, but then importantly, act upon that information rather than suppressing it because it's inconvenient, and it often is. That's something that can be cultivated as well.
Yeah, I'm super curious to dive into kind of building on top of this. So as you're traveling, going to new cities, going to new cultures, new countries, all of this, how have you kind of approached exploring actually like cross-cultural context? Like how have you actually approached, if someone is in a completely different cultural context, their perception of the world is entirely different. And I found on my travels it was a lot more challenging than I initially thought to actually like explore that with people, because a lot of times it's just like, where are you from, what's your name, all right, cool, like that's all I need to know. And it's obviously not every single person's going to want to dive super deep into their cultural framework and all of this stuff. But it sounds like, from what I've read of your work, it sounds like you have had chances to really dive into and get to know people from other cultures on a deep level, so much so that like the cultural framework starts to bubble up and you get to kind of explore that liminal space between cultures and between um, just life experiences and environments, right? And I'm super curious how you go about like it sounds like, just in terms of like even just networking or relationships or conversations, like when you go to like a new culture, I would love to just hear whatever arises within you at this moment around like cross-cultural exploration.
I think part of it is having the time to do it. You might periodically accidentally have a deep conversation with people at a bar or something like that, just somebody you've never met before. Every once in a while that happens, but you can't really plan on it. More frequently, you find out not just where the catalyst for those types of conversations might be, in what topic, in what setting, etc., but also you're trusted enough and you trust them enough as well to both be in the right state, to be comfortable enough to be psychologically prepared to have a difficult conversation, or to have a deep conversation about differences, about similarities, about history. It does help in some cases to have a bit of knowledge going in about what topics might be difficult, about what topics might be worth bringing up in a very careful, sensitive way and a non-pushy way. I think part of it too is just being willing to look dumb, and just being willing to be perceived as the dumbest person in the room. And I think that's valuable for travel in general, because that's typically how you learn things, but it's also typically how you demonstrate a certain type of epistemic humility, and cultural humility and experience humility and everything else. But being willing to show the depths of your ignorance in a lot of cases is great, because it gives other people the opportunity to step in and be the teacher. And that way, one, you might then have the opportunity to do the same in reverse, and it creates that type of a relationship, which is often tighter than just a transient sort of relationship. But it's also not you leading with that and running the risk of lecturing or being perceived as somebody who is presenting themselves as having all the answers. And I think if you can show that you don't have all the answers first, then it's much easier to have that type of crosstalk that eventually turns into some kind of dialogue that's valuable. Hopefully that makes sense. It's not an easy thing to do, but once you get into that habit, then it's a whole lot easier everywhere, anywhere, with anyone, to look like an idiot, because you realize actually the consequences are not bad. Who cares? And people are much more willing, I think, in a lot of cases too, to take seriously the things that you do say with any type of authority behind it, because they know that you're willing to admit when you don't know things, which I think is also quite valuable.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I almost have this sense as well traveling, I did have an opportunity to have a couple very deep cultural conversations. And I had this sense of like, there's almost like the person wanted to, but there was no like good entry point into it. Right. And so it's almost like I have this sense of like looking dumb and just like saying something that's dumb, but in a very humble way is almost like, all right, like I'm giving you the entry point if you also want to dive into this, you know, but without that first, it's almost like there's no, it's kind of just this awkwardness of both people kind of maybe wanting to, but not really knowing how. I almost get that sense.
Yeah, and it's easy to do. I mean, there's no foolproof way to do any of this, and there's no tricks. Like if you're trying to do tricks, that's usually a bad way, because that implies that you're trying to pull a fast one on somebody you don't even know
Right,
yet.
right.
But I mean, I find typically just pointing at something that you don't understand or something that's different. Like, why do they do that? Why is it that color? Why do they do that type of awning? What's that poster about? Who are these people? Who is that guy?
Mhm.
And almost always you can get some kind of response because they realize I've got all the answers and I don't even have to try. This guy is learning so much. And just be gracious, as far as they want to go with the conversation, be gracious about it because you're learning something, but it's also something that could then build rapport over time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I would love to dive deeper into this epistemic humility. You brought up epistemic humility, and I would love to dive deeper into your work, your journalism work. I've found it so fascinating, the amount, the duration, and the amounts of episodes you've released on Let's Know Things, and then all of these new projects that are coming forth in the last year or so. Um, I'm just fascinated by your ability to consistently do some deep research on a topic in the world today, and then to present it in this very um, eloquent, like just really like like doing the research first, and then just presenting the research in a way, um, given your certain frame. And I have this sense of like there's a deep, I sense a deep epistemic humility. Honestly, I sense this deep, like, I don't know what's going on in the world. Let me explore what's out there without assuming that I know what's going on, and then let's see what comes up, and then let's say explore it in a podcast. So I'm super curious. Um, how has the podcast kind of influenced your worldview and your kind of epistemic, humble frame?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, I'm glad it comes across that way. So actually, Let's Know Things, my main podcast and the one I've been doing longest since 2016, that was something I started when I was living in Wichita, Kansas. That was one of the projects, my excuse in a way to learn about doing audio work, because I'd done a few audio books, but I hadn't done a podcast before. But I listened to them and really liked them and thought that might be fun, a fun thing to try out. Let's just on a whim. But also, yeah, kind of as you mentioned, actually, it is just me wanting to learn more. And most, most, if not all of my work, I'm trying to think if this is not the case for anything that I'm doing today. I think all of my work is really just me taking stuff that I'm doing anyway and attaching a little dynamo to it so that it then turns out something that other people can use, and then hopefully they'll learn something from it as well, and we can learn together, and we'll all be a little bit better off for it. But I mean, it's really an excuse. Let's Know Things. I was doing news analysis columns in newspapers from actually high school onward, and it's something I stopped doing at some point, but I really enjoy it, where you essentially just I read a lot about what's happening in the world and explain it, usually to my friends or family who are like, dude, what's going on? Explain this to me. I don't get it. And I try to figure out a way to recalibrate all that information and express it in a way that's useful, but hopefully doesn't opt for so much concision that it loses meaning and context, because all of these things, this is one of my grand theories of information in life, everything is interconnected with everything else. And so part of it too was just showing through this podcast that all of these things happening in the world are connected to so many other different things. So even if you don't think it's not relevant to you because it's happening way over there or in an industry that you don't even know about, it's connected to you. And putting that all into a, I don't know, 30-40 minute episode each week was my starting point, because it seemed like enough to work with, but also something that was, I mean, relatively succinct enough for the podcasting world. I mean, at the time, podcasts were much longer than they are today, I will say. This is another, it's like the blogging thing where I have no idea what people going into it think about it now. But at the time, 30 to 40 minutes was quite reasonable. But that was really just my excuse, yeah, to go out and learn. And it gave me the excuse then to dive even deeper into more and a wider variety of topics, because then it was something that I was presenting to a global audience potentially, rather than just my friends and family. And I mean, all the other stuff I'm doing, Brain Lenses is another one that I do. It's another podcast and essays that I write. And I did that because I realized I have so many biases. I have so many veils over my thinking, so many lenses, brain lenses, that distort the way that I see the world. And I've been discovering these piecemeal over the course of my life and trying my best to adjust for them as I can, because you can't really get rid of them, but you can adjust for them whenever I discover them. But especially once I started doing Let's Know things, I had all of these preconceived notions about all of these different elements of life and history and technology and economics and everything else that I figured, well, I'm learning this stuff for myself, but I might as well teach other people too, because half of the answers to questions that I receive from people about the news could pretty accurately be summed up using some of these biases and explanations of the way that we behave and the way that we perceive things. So yeah, I mean, basically any project that I have today and anything that I do and any book that I've written probably could almost certainly be seen through the lens of it being self-serving, but self-serving in a way that I hope also serves other people and provides some value.
That's amazing. I love the point about everything being interconnected. And yeah, I would have to say my experience with Let's Know things at the beginning was kind of like, I didn't immediately get into it because I was like, what does this have to do with me? You know, what is this random topic, you know, like that I know nothing about in the news right now? Like, how is that related, you know? And then coming back to it, it's exactly that. It's like, oh, there's actually, like, you can find, if someone, like, here's an article about XYZ that I feel like has no relation to me, but if I can kind of sense the biases through which they're like, or the narratives that are kind of being propagated through this article, then I can kind of start to understand culture. I can start to understand how I've been influenced by culture, you know, or it's like all of these things. And so I'm fascinated to explore that. And I've been having this sense that is the most meaningful thing, at least in my life, is actually exploring interconnectedness, exploring how everything like that we're doing is connected somehow to economics, to politics, to culture, to all of this stuff. And I would love to just hear, like, how has that generated meaning for you? You know, like, how have you, it sounds like I have this assumption that you have somehow had a lot of meaning, become like you find meaning in the fact that it's interconnected, and then just exploring that. So I'm curious if you could riff on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so at the most base level, I think it's beautiful. I think it's something that shapes my worldview. I'm not religious, I'm not spiritual, but I do like finding connections between things and seeing the connections between things and understanding things to whatever degree I'm capable of understanding them, on whatever level I'm capable of understanding them. And it's something that's just so pervasive and satisfying. This is actually something that we have as humans too. There's a condition, or a pre-schizophrenic condition called apophenia, where we start to make connections between things to the point where we're seeing patterns in everything. It's like the beautiful mind syndrome, where you see patterns that aren't there and you start to see faces in things that aren't there. But we all have that to some degree. We just don't have extreme versions of it, where we see conspiracy theories everywhere because we're connecting dots that aren't actually connected, but they seem to be connected, and it's viscerally satisfying to feel like they are, to the point where these things are just entertaining. And it's like really cool to think about. I know about these biases. I still find conspiracy theories absolutely fascinating and fun to think about, because even though I don't think most of them are true, some of them are probably, but even though most of them aren't true, it's like really cool. What if this and this and this and this and all of them connected? That would be super neat. Yeah. So there's something in this worldview, I think, that connects to that same sense of like low grade apophenia. But part of it too, so two things. One is that one definition of creativity is finding connections between seemingly disconnected things. And I think that there's a reason creating visual artwork or writing or doing the news or cooking all feel like similar things in my brain. It's making connections between things and then creating some kind of output with that. So it's not something that I can really quantify, but it's something that feels quite good. And it's something that makes a lot of sense to me on that visceral level. But two, there's this concept, what was the guy's name? Ted Nelson. One of the early pioneers before the web was created. He invented like a pre-web internet thing. And he coined a bunch of just absolutely silly terms that are awesome as well. And one of them is intertwingularity. And intertwingularity basically says, or it means that all of the categories we've created to contain knowledge, they're all made up. It's like the lines that we draw on maps. There's no actual lines out in the world designating where America ends and Canada begins or something. These are things that we've made up and agree to pretend are real. And this theory, and this is something that I believe and behave as if this is true, I think, is that the same is true between like medical knowledge and math and painting and cooking and history, or the history of the Romans. And like you can take absolutely every bit of knowledge and everything that you might study or do and connect it in all of these ways. And we've categorized it because it makes it easier to specialize and teach these things. It makes it easier to turn them into careers and to operate within practical reality, which, you know, is good to a certain degree. It's good to operate within practical reality and to be able to pay rent and buy groceries and things. But in terms of our larger scale, macro understanding of everything, it can be quite limiting. And for me, all of these bits of knowledge seem like just nodes in a giant web of information, all of the things interconnected. And the more connections I can make, the more satisfying it is, but the better I understand each of those disparate nodes as well.
Yeah, it almost feels like understanding one node deeper will help you understand all the other nodes deeper to a certain degree.
Exactly. Another visual that I have, and these are just random, the random visuals that pop into my head whenever I think about this type of thing, is a bunch of sticks leaning against each other. And you can like stand a stick up like this and straight up and balance it. But if you lean all of these sticks together, the more you lean, the more stable it becomes. And I tend to think the same is true. You can go ultra deep on one topic, but like Da Vinci, he was doing all kinds of shit. He was doing medical stuff. He was doing visual arts. He was building weapons of war for a bunch of lords. Like the more stuff you do, all of those things have the potential to inform the other things that you're doing. And even though it's great to go super deep on surgical knowledge, if you're becoming a surgeon, you never know when your knowledge of archery might strangely help you discover something new within your field of surgery.
Yeah, I've been hearing this term come up a lot, like transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, or like there's been this term that's becoming really popular, at least in this spaces. I spent a lot of time in, like meta. We add meta to like everything now.
Yeah, that's the term of the moment, isn't it? Even Zuckerberg got his hands on it.
Yeah, Zuckerberg. Yeah, but it's just like a meta crisis or meta system or meta psychology, or like everything's adding meta, and it almost feels like what we're speaking about, you know, like in a sense there's like psychology, but meta psychology is like, all right, there's psychology, but in fact everything else is actually like psychology. There's like, it's an arbitrary boundary to say this is psychology and this is not psychology, right? It's like in some sense there's actually like something that's giving rise to both of them, that we just put an arbitrary boundary in between and call this one psychology and this one neuroscience or something. I don't know.
There's actually a game that you can play on Wikipedia. And I don't know how many, I think it's down to 3 degrees, where you can connect any Wikipedia page to any other Wikipedia page by clicking on the links. And it used to be 6 degrees. And now I think there's people, they've turned it into like a competition where as quickly as possible, you get from like philosophy to Hitler, or, you know, from the old game used to be 6 clicks to Hitler or 6 clicks to Jesus. And now I think they have people competing for just two random terms, and then they try to figure out the quickest way between those terms. And they all interconnect. It's super meta, but that's a term that used to be useful, and now it's becoming so common that I think it's losing some of its value. So we're going to have to come up with a new term.
Right. Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear your take on how do you not become overwhelmed in an age of information where there's just so much, and I feel you're somehow positioned to answer this in a way that I'm not, because doing hundreds and hundreds of podcasts on very specific, like going really deep and getting a lot of information and research and like condensing it and synthesizing it. I'm curious how you like maintain a level of sanity given the amount of information possible to research in any given moment.
I would say that I do it imperfectly. There was definitely a time at the beginning, back when the pandemic started, just with all of that and the sheer magnitude of it, and remembering too, and this is super important to remember, like we get lost in statistics. We're very good at empathizing with individual people. We're very bad at empathizing with a million people. And when we started to lose thousands and then hundreds of thousands and now millions of people worldwide to this disease, that got really big, and I worked through it. I can actually look back at episodes and remember, oh, that was the day after the breakup, and that was the day after returning to the US, and that was the day that it became clear that we were going to have lockdowns for quite some time and everything was going to change. And it does get to me, and it gets to me in a way usually that kind of fires me up, because another one of my grand theories is that a lot of the problems we have, not all of them, but a lot of the problems we have could be solved if people were better informed. And that's better informed in terms of data, understanding things in a factual manner, also self-understanding and understanding other people around the world. And anything that I can do to increase that understanding is helping to some degree, to whatever limited way I can as an individual, using that theory, that's helping. And so I tend to funnel a lot of that concern and sadness and at times misery and sometimes pain into that helps quite a bit. In normal times, or more normal times, I guess, I've just gotten very efficient at processing information and soaking up a whole lot and figuring out what I can safely discard, what I can set aside to check into later, and what's something that's probably useful for now, rather than taking in the entire deluge, because every day it is, if you're not careful, it's a deluge of information. And a lot of it, although theoretically useful to someone, is not something that you need to take in and really fully experience right now. And learning the difference, and this is unfortunate because a lot of people, I think, it makes a whole lot of sense, quite intuitively will say, well, I'm just not going to engage with the news then because it stresses me out, it causes anxiety. I actually started a whole new project, a handful of months ago, called One Sentence News, where I every day, every morning, send out an email, and now I have a podcast version too, of just like one sentence of summary and one sentence of context for 3 different news items. And that's it, because I know it's stressful, but I also know that when you separate yourself from it, it's kind of like separating yourself from people and then someday being exposed to a disease and you don't have any immunity and you haven't worked that muscle, it's atrophied. And consequently, then in the future, as you are exposed to that type of information, including the news, it's overwhelming because you don't have the muscle memory of knowing how to deal with it. Whereas if you can take small doses of it on a regular basis, you get better at it. And so that's, again, this is my theory. It's predicated on some research. It's mostly predicated on just people that I've spoken to in my own experiences. But I personally find that engaging with this stuff and coming up with methods and routines that allow me to do it in a healthy way is superior from backing away from it, both in the short term and the long term, even if it doesn't always seem like it in the short term sometimes.
Yeah, fascinating. I find I'm probably in that category that just backs away from the news and like
I get it. I get it.
Yeah, Yeah, I tend to favor books. I usually just go like I will read books for hours and hours a day, but I tend to stay away from just like the super temporary stuff. I have this feeling in my mind that if it's going to be gone in 2 days, then like why would I read it type of thing.
Well, I understand that argument, but at the same time, I would also argue that the value in situational awareness is different from the value in historical or longer scope awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it is like a super privileged position to say that I don't need to know what's happening in the world because it won't affect me, but it will affect a whole lot of other people. And these things that are temporary, it might go away in a day or two, but in that day or two, maybe tons of people die, or maybe tons of people lose their jobs, or maybe an entire industry changes. And you might be aware of it 5 years later when a book is written about it, but you might not be able to make smart decisions or fully informed decisions, rather, today, because you don't have that information about how everything changed in X, Y, and Z industry. So there's a lot of reasons to do it. I don't look down upon or have any grief for anybody who steps away. I totally get it. Sometimes I have that exact same impulse. And on the weekends, my weekends are relatively long compared to most people's, but on the weekends being days that I don't have one sentence news or let's know things to work on, I do completely step away from it and mostly just read books and poetry and other stuff. And I gleefully delete all of the news-oriented newsletters that I get in my inbox every single day that I usually process.
Amazing, amazing. I would love to explore sensing into what is worth consuming in the news and what is not. And I've been in these circles that have been talking about there's becoming a lot more talk about social media being captured by one, just sensationalized content, but I'm more fascinated by, all right, there's these we call them like memes or like mimetic like narratives that are kind of being propagated, right? And it's almost like there's like these different memes that are like all fighting against each other on the internet. And I think it sounds like you'd be positioned to understand this in a certain way, where how do you go about like, are you reading different news sources? And then and this is what I was fascinated with when you spoke about one sentence news. You get the sentence and then the context. How do you kind of approach sensing into what the context is, or sensing into, all right, here's one news source, this seems to be the bias which it's operating under, here's another news source, here seems to be the position that it's operating under, and kind of trying to approach it in a way where you can kind of sense into how like these different narratives and biases, and kind of just watch all of them kind of fighting against each other and trying to find the context between them.
A lot of it is just experience, and then learning over time which are reliable ones and which aren't. I mean, very, very big, simplistic rules of thumb: read the news, don't read the editorials. There are a lot of left-leaning and right-leaning publications that are just atrocious in terms of their editorial. That's the opinion content. And in some cases, they blend it to a degree that is just a travesty for journalistic standards. I would say don't get your news from TV, actually, because TV almost always, no matter the network, blends their editorial and their news coverage. So TV mostly universally sucks for the news. You're going to get a whole lot more slant than you do with written content. In general, entities like Reuters and the Associated Press are quite good. They're very centered. They don't do editorial content. Imagine that. But then you can also find, like, in general, the New York Times is considered to be more liberal. Their editorial content, I think, sucks. They're very good for news. The Wall Street Journal is considered to be quite conservative, and their editorial content is abominable, but their news coverage is generally quite good. So you kind of learn to differentiate based on that. And then you can look at other sources and say, oh, well, I want to know what the voice pieces, the mouthpieces of the right are saying. I want to know what the mouthpieces of the left are saying, and you know who to check for that too, to establish that broader context. But in general, if you're just wanting to be aware, this takes away a lot of the stress of the news too. Don't look at the people just jabbing all day at each other and just creating nothing but noise, because that creates clicks. Do away with it and just get the raw materials as close to pure data as you possibly can, and you'll be much better off for it. And the same is true, I think, also on social media, where social media is so much better. I actually love Twitter. I get so much good information from Twitter because I follow experts. Don't follow a bunch of people who are just, they are there because they're entertaining, because they shout nonsense. Like, I get it. Nonsense can be fun. And I love memes or versions of memes. There's a whole lot of hilarious, awesome, brilliant content being created on the internet today, but differentiate that from when you're trying to get information. You do not want to trust random podcaster guy or random YouTube guy when you're trying to get medical information. And you don't want to trust people shouting angry comments on Twitter when you're trying to get legitimate news. These will almost always be people who either have a vapid, vacant sort of authority that has nothing to do with the stuff that they're talking about, or they are going for emotional resonance as opposed to actually trying to deliver content that is data-driven. So again, very superficial, broad strokes, rules of thumb. But for me, that's what makes it mostly tolerable and not miserable, is that there's kind of a filtration process to begin with, where most of the junk, not all of it, but most of the junk just doesn't reach you to begin with.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I have this sense of the harder it is to read, not the harder it is to read, the better, but in the sense of like, if super sensational, we're gonna have a super easy, catchy headline versus like, all right, here's like a 5-page article on XYZ that actually is gonna take some effort to read. I'm not gonna be able to bulldoze through it in 30 seconds.
You know what it is, though? It's kind of the difference between fast food and eating like a well-prepared meal, where so I don't know what your eating habits are like, but I found as soon as I started cooking and I stopped eating prepared, like microwavable and takeout meals basically all the time, my taste reacclimated. So I wasn't addicted and expecting just a high level of both preservatives and sugars, which is kind of what these things are loaded up with, for better and for worse. The same is true with information, I think. And the thing that we get hooked on when we're just taking in the easy stuff, what seems easy, the corn syrup of information transmission, I think, that can hook us, is emotional resonance. And it's stuff that seems fun or easier because it punches us right in the feelings. And in a lot of cases, too, the tribalism. And it's stuff that has a clear enemy, a clear right and wrong. And it's something that riles us up. And it feels really, really good to either feel emotionally quite good or emotionally quite upset and outraged. And these are the things I think you'll notice if you look for it. The stuff that seems easy to consume and the things that we do casually without having to think about it, that's the stuff that's trying to grab us by the emotions and shake us. And typically, not always, but typically when different people or organizations try to do this, they're doing it because that's how you manipulate people. You either manipulate them to agree with you and your tribe or your ideology or your belief system, or you do it because you're trying to get them to buy something. And I mean, that's basically what it is. It's something that makes us a little bit dumber. We are less clinical in the way we deal with information, and we're less critical in the way that we parse information when we are emotionally riled up in one way or the other. And so the stuff that seems more difficult actually gets so much easier because you don't feel like you're being manipulated. Once you do it a little bit, you get a taste for the non-corn syrup laden stuff at least. Then you open up Reuters and you're like, oh my God, this is just like the pure stuff. It's not kale. I don't want to spit it out, but it's something that's well made and it's not loaded up with corn syrup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get the sense as well. You spoke on like not right or wrong. It's almost like I get the sense after potentially reading a less sensational thing. I get done reading it and it's like, I don't know what the point was. Like there was no like, I want you to believe this or that. It's just like,
there's no call to action. Yeah.
There's no call to action. Yeah.
And that means you have to think, and it sucks when you're not used to it. Again, this is another one of those things that you build up the muscle for it. And so much of the content we consume, part of the reason it's so enjoyable is that our brain doesn't like to spend energy. Like our brain is lazy, and there's good biological survival-oriented reasons for that. Our brain uses like 20% of the total energy we consume, which is nuts for the size of the brain. And it does everything that it can to be energy efficient so that it doesn't have to work very hard. And so when something comes to you and says, dude, I'm just going to feed you content, just shovel it on in, that's what we want. We want that. We want calls to action. We want somebody to tell us what to think about whatever it is we're reading. And it's difficult, especially at first, but even sometimes later, because it's actual work to have to take in information and make a decision for ourselves what we believe about it. I know a lot of people, and I understand the impulse with this too, who don't want to know what happened with the news. They want to know how their political party is responding to it, because that then tells them how to think. And I get it. We're not all specialists. We don't all understand the intricacies of law or politics or all the things happening in the world. And it makes sense in some cases to then foist that responsibility on somebody else who we do perceive to be an expert on those things. But that's also what makes us increasingly ignorant and increasingly desirous of information that is spoon-fed to us. And at some point too, that's how we get taken advantage of, where these people that we've decided to trust with all of these things can make us vote for just about anything, including things that are not in our self-interest. So, I mean, there's a very practical reason to maintain at least some semblance, not an always on sense of situational awareness, because that can be just panic inducing, but enough that we are capable of looking at this information, taking it in, and parsing the value from it, and then critically ourselves, without anybody else influencing the decision, deciding what we think about it, and then ideally forming our own opinions, and even more ideally, having strong opinions, but keeping them very loosely held so that we are willing to change our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the tribes kind of fighting against each other, a frame that I heard really recently on this that was so fascinating was there's almost like this dehumanizing component where it's like, if I'm in this tribe and you're in that tribe, it's almost like putting the other tribe as like less than human. Like, how could they do that? It's like, that's like pure evil, right? And I heard this. It's like, what if we just went to the other person and it's like, what is it like to be you? You know, like ask them. And I think this is where I wanted to go earlier as well. Like, what would it look like to just go to each tribe and just be like, what is it like to be you? You know, like to rehumanize them, if that's even a word, to rehumanize them again. And like, all right, there's this side. What is it like to be you? There's this side. What's it like to be you? Oh, then there's all these other contexts too. What is it like to be all of these contexts, right? Well, and I had a couple other directions I wanted to go, but they kind of slipped me at the moment. But more so with, I've heard the phrase polluting the information ecology, where it's just like all these things are kind of polluting it. And I'm fascinated to explore, because let's know things feels like a really good example of unpolluted information, in the sense of most the things that get the most views are the ones that are most sensational. So there's almost a shift in this talk of how do we like actually put information out there that hasn't been polluted by these, like, this side's wrong, this side's wrong, this side's wrong, we're right, this is wrong. And yeah, so I'm super curious about kind of your thoughts on that, as well as how have you approached, what are your thoughts on like dialogue as a way to kind of overcome some of these like biases and cognitive traps?
On the first point, I mean, I wish I knew how to do that. Part of the reason I've been trying so many different things is that I don't know. And I've been very, very, very fortunate that I can actually, make part of my living off of doing this kind of work, which is wonderful, and not something that everybody doing incredible work. There's so much incredible work out there that's just not being funded because it's not Fox News or MSNBC. If you can't rile people up, it's very difficult to get advertisers, but it's also very difficult to convince people to create a habit around it. So yeah, I wish I knew how to get people to eat less fast food in that regard. I'm going to keep trying though. And, honestly, I'm enthusiastic. I don't use a lot of social media, and I use it for very specific purposes when I do, but I am optimistic about the potential of these tools. All of them have potential to help us spread information and to do it in different ways and to reach people in different ways. And that's part of why after 5 years of doing a show that, is 30 to 40-minute podcast episodes, I decided to do a daily show rather than weekly. That's like 2 or 3 minutes. Like it's a big difference for me, but it's something that I think might translate better to people who don't necessarily have the trained attention span or desire or time to sit with one topic for that long, which I think is perfectly legitimate. I think the impetus is on us to figure out how to send out information to different people rather than getting angry that they're not going to read my books in paperback anymore. So I'm going to get angry rather than figuring out how to deliver the same information in different ways. It's not productive, but it also doesn't make a lot of logical sense. In terms of dialogue, I think there's potential for it. And actually, I've read some very heartening and not heartening at the same time research on it, that when you do get people together and in contexts where it's understood what they're doing and it's understood that it's a non-threatening situation to the best of the organizer's ability to set it up and stuff, if you can get people to talk one-on-one, then they actually do tend to get through to each other and walk away with better opinions of their other, the person that is the enemy of their perceived tribe. But the same research also says that it doesn't scale. So you can get people together in very small groups and put them together one-on-one. You can't get a group of 1,000 people and 1,000 people together and figure out ways to arrange it and have them talk, because at a certain scale, the presence of one's own tribe starts to influence their ability to bend and to perceive the vile enemy as something close to the same type of human as they are. So I'm not sure. I mean, that's part of what I love about travel, is that it kind of forces you into situations where you have to do that. And it incentivizes you to lull people into the same sense of security so that they feel comfortable doing it as well, more often than not, at least. And I personally have been fortunate to have a lot of conversations like that with people with whom I disagree about essentially everything, but we still got along and we found things that we could agree upon, even if it's just talking about the weather, what's happening around us in that moment, talking about something that's coming to mind in particular is when I was traveling in my RV. I had vast ideological differences with most of the people I met. They still helped me with the problems I couldn't figure out in my RV, and I still helped them fix their website issues they were having problems with. You can figure out ways to connect, and I find personally, especially if you can avoid super loaded terms and you can kind of jujitsu your way around common slogans that people shout. Like, a lot of people don't have opinions about things. They just repeat slogans that they've heard their teams say. Right. If you can avoid those landmines, then in a lot of cases, you can reach a point where the other person, even if they know that you are the vile enemy, they don't feel threatened by you. And you can do the same thing if you can tamp down your own desire to feel threatened and to feel like you need to correct them or that you need to proselytize to them. If you can do that, then you tend to be in a good spot. Again, I don't think this is something we can do on scale, at least not using this specific method, but one-on-one, individually, it's something that we can aim for in ourselves to try to have some of that epistemic humility and to not believe that we have all the answers, to believe with good reason, I think, that we can learn something even from people with whom we disagree, but then also think that we might stand a chance of building relationships that can bridge some of these divides that are usually artificially created anyway.
Yeah, I noticed something. I found myself a couple years ago kind of really going deep into certain ideas about how the world works. And then there was like a sense of superiority from that, right? And yeah, it sounds like there's this approach, which I've been trying to develop recently, which is like, perhaps there's actually partial truth in every single human on this planet, right? Like, perhaps what if we approached every single human as if, not as if, I already know you're wrong and I'm going to try to listen to what you have to say and be kind, and then I'm just going to go on my way, versus what if there's actually something you have based on life experience and your specific context that you're living within right now, that I actually could valuably understand that I don't at this moment. Like, what if every single conversation was approached that way? How different would the cross-cultural, like the how much could we temper the tribalism and the polarization of today's age?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it would be lovely. I think it's difficult. I personally have found just some, again, very broad strokes, rules of thumb that work for me is when somebody says something that I find myself reflexively wanting to correct or disagree with them. They say something, some political thing or belief thing that I disagree with, and my inclination is to say, well, actually, though. Instead, I say, huh, tell me more about that. Like I've created a habit around it, because often then we can take it a bit further, and it expresses, even if it's at first at least false, some sense of humility that you're concealing your tribal rage with. Then you can usually get to a deeper level of things. You can get past the bumper sticker slogans that everybody shouts at each other, and you can get to some more fundamental beliefs. And then almost always, in fact, I don't think I've ever had this not be the case, you can get to something that you can then latch on to and say, oh, this is a human being. This is somebody clearly has similar wants and needs and beliefs and goals to what I have. Here's some similarities, something that I can cling to, and here is a safe realm of dialogue that we can have as well. Here's something that I can say, oh yeah, totally, absolutely, and agree with effusively, as opposed to if I would have come in and corrected them because I believe I'm right and I think that they're saying something that's offensive and it makes me angry. It shuts down the conversation immediately. And not only am I an asshole to them, I've also verified everything that they believe about people who disagree with them.
Right. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. Yeah, I'm so fascinated by this attempt of like, you look at like the political parties, it's like, all right, there's like you talked about them as like landmines, right? There's like these kind of these landmines of or these just slogans and phrases that kind of get parroted. And I've been fascinated by like, all right, what is like the underlying desires that are kind of giving rise to those? What if both sides are actually seeking some sort of security or a feeling of just peace and well-being in their life? And like, what if like the way that they do it is through these things that seem so polar opposite? But if you kind of just like, why are you like saying this is how the world needs to change this way, or why are you saying the world needs to be this way? It's like, oh, you both think that's what will cause the most well-being, you know, or like there's potentially some. I found that fascinating. You say, if you just say, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. Like, what if you actually can dig down to that? Oh, you have this desire for security, or for, oh, me too. Like, I have that same feeling of like, I want some sort of well-being or security or peace or something. Like, I have that too. Like, interesting. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's not easy because we're fighting against our own, I would say, worst inclinations, but they're natural inclinations. I mean, this is all stuff that has been with us since we've been bipedal. And so it's not something that's new. It's just we're seeing amplified versions of all of our antisocial, well, pro-social in some ways, pro-social and antisocial behaviors that cause us to come into conflict with each other, but also then cause us to gather together in defense against the hated enemy. I think a lot of us do have very important and valid differences in beliefs, and we're not going to all agree on everything and just sing kumbaya one day and no longer disagree. I don't think it would be healthy if we did. I think we need different views on things and different opinions. I just ideally think that the infrastructure that, well, for a lot of modern history anyway, has helped us not kill each other as we sort out our disagreements and figure out which direction we're going to steer a given society. That infrastructure really needs bulwarking. We need to figure out a way to make sure, like, even if it's not going to be exactly the same as it always has been, but things like some type of government, some type of means of delivering accurate information. This is why journalism is something that I'm quite fond of, because I believe that without these sorts of things, we find ourselves in a situation where the only logical conclusion is to kill each other. And I don't want that to happen. Call me crazy, but I sincerely hope we don't start killing each other or kill each other any more than we already have over beliefs that ideally inform and balance each other and help everybody flourish.
Absolutely. Yeah, it almost feels like we're in one of the most heated times I've ever lived in, and perhaps in a while. And looking back on the pandemic and everything, I tend to take the perspective of like, wow, that's amazing. So much got brought to the surface that was completely latent and what was just kind of sitting there and had no reason to come to the surface until something like this happened. And wow, now we can see so much that has been brought to the surface that otherwise would have not. And now here it is. Let's use that,
Yeah, again, it's difficult because there's no good in a situation that's killed so many millions of people. But I do believe that you can look at anything and scramble to try to find some silver linings and make the best of an absolutely horrible, devastating situation. And I think that's exactly one of the most important silver linings of this particular horribleness, is that it has made so many people say the quiet part loud, and it's made so many societies show their vulnerabilities. And these are things we could have dealt with so long ago, but just like our brains, I think our societies are often quite lazy, and they fall into a routine where they don't want to like overreact, because if you overreact, especially in democratic societies, you get voted out because you're just crying about nothing, and you're saying that the sky is going to fall and nothing's going to happen. You're crying wolf, and nothing happens, and then eventually the wolf shows up, and we're like, oh shit, why didn't we do that thing? Why didn't we invest in more masks? Why didn't we start developing mRNA vaccines before this, when we had the technology clearly leading up to this? I think a lot of these things, a lot of these potholes that we've had for a very long time will be filled in. A lot of our bridges that have been rickety, and some of which have now collapsed, will be repaired. And I think we'll be in an overall better state if and when we can put a lot of this uncertainty and a lot of the tumult of the moment behind us. And I don't think we're going to go back to anything approximating normal. And I don't think we should. Ideally, we try to do things better and recognize that this will happen again, this and more horrific permutations of it. And by this, I mean both pandemics, but also social inequities and economic issues and supply chain issues. And I mean, essentially every single issue that we've seen over the course of the past couple of years, we should expect this to continue and figure out how we can build a better foundation so that when it happens in the future, we are more equipped to, in some cases, like stand very stolid and firm against it, but in some cases bend with the wind and be flexible enough to go with it and not suffer as much damage as a consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of the term anti-fragile. How can we create anti-fragile societies rather than ones that will just break at the first sign of disaster?
Ideally, yeah, things that get stronger with the stresses, right? Yeah, I mean, like a muscle. Ideally, the more strain makes us more resilient and stronger. Right. But as it's been the past couple of years, unfortunately, that hasn't been the case in many aspects of society. And part of that's because of larger inequities. Part of that's just shortcomings in the system itself. And hopefully what we do is one of the takeaways from this is we look at that structure and say, how do we reinforce the good parts and remove or change some of the bad ones?
Yeah, absolutely. And just the sheer number of people and interactions and complexity also is like, yeah, it doesn't seem like an easy task whatsoever,
No, none of this is easy, and none of it's anything that any one of us can do, but we can be microcosms of that, and we can decide ourselves to do things, whatever our personal capacity for this is, to do things that makes life better for us, but also better for the societies of which we are an atomic component.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. I wanted to end it off with a little fun notes. You brought up in one of your books the term Lifspeki.
Oh, Lifspeki.
Lifspeki. Yeah, I would love to hear. Could you describe what that is? And I would love to hear kind of how you understand your own Lifspeki. And yeah, I don't know. I love that part when you brought that up in one of your books.
Yeah, so Lifspeki, it's an Icelandic word that, I mean, basically, I think the literal translation is like life spirit, the spirit of life. And what it means in application, though, is it's not just your philosophy, it's not your beliefs, it is the philosophy or beliefs that you express to the world through your actions. So you don't tell somebody about your Lifspeki, you show them. I show what I believe through the things that I do. And this was an especially important term for me to learn when I did, because I was going through the initial processes. I fairly recently still just hit the road, and I was trying to recalibrate my life and set things up in such a way that I could do more of what I cared about and focus more of my time and energy and resources on things that I actually found to be vital, rather than heading toward kind of cookie cutter templated goals that I inherited. And today, I mean, that's shaped what I do today in a lot of ways. I don't think that I'm in any final form. I expect to continue growing and changing and iterating, hopefully. I mean, if I ever look back at the 5-year-old version of me from the past and say, oh, I'm exactly the same, nothing has changed, that's a bad sign, because it means I haven't grown. But today, I think getting to do what I do and getting to care about the things that I care about and invest myself in the things that I care about the way that I do and have the time for all of these things, that's a direct consequence of thinking about my beliefs in that way. Because it's one thing to say you believe something, it's another thing to act upon those beliefs. And a whole lot of people don't, including myself back in the day. And I'm sure there's probably beliefs that I have today that I haven't fully acknowledged or recognized yet, that at some point, ideally, I will incorporate into my actions as well. So that's the meaning for that term in my life, at least, has been figuring out how to better align the things that I do and the way that I live with my actual beliefs.
That's amazing. I can say it looks like you value journalism a lot. It shows up in your.
I almost majored in it. I ended up going for design and illustration instead, but journalism has a very special place in my heart.
That's fascinating. Kind of your points on it's just what you're doing today is a product of being in Iceland and everything that came before it and up until this point. And I'm fascinated, like, how do you make a living like doing journalism and podcasts? Like, well, it's probably the culmination of years and years and years.
Yeah, exactly. When people ask how you make a living off of a podcast, I say, based on my experience, you do it for 5 years. I mean, essentially, a lot of what I do with the writing and everything too, some of us at least are fortunate to get lucky breaks, or we have advantageous situations. Everybody's got different variables. And so nobody's experience will be the same. And the same work by 2 different people will lead to different results. But almost always, if you don't know how to get to where you want to be, just put in a bunch of time and set things up in such a way that you can put in that time without the rest of your life suffering as a consequence. Don't burn yourself out. And then typically you'll get closer to where you want to be. You'll get to where you want to be, or you'll have a better understanding of the things that you need to know to actually get to where you want to be. That's been my experience. Just durability. Durability is one of the best attributes somebody can have, above and beyond even things like aggressiveness or the ability to sleep 2 hours a night.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, it feels like a good wrap up point. I really appreciate I really appreciate the conversation, Colin. Thank you
It's
for
my
being on the
pleasure.
show. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, great talking to you. This is fun.
yeah, amazing.